Hey everybody, measles. It's in the news recently with that big outbreak in Texas and other states. We're going to tell you how much of a threat that is, what to watch out for, and how to protect your kids and family. It's The Buzz, Parenting and Pediatrics with me, Dr. B. You know, measles has been around for a long time. The genetic studies we have suggest that measles has been causing problems for humans since about 500 BC. And the earliest written accounts are from the 9th century. This is strictly a human disease. There are no animal reservoirs, which means that only humans can get it and only humans can carry it. Only humans can give it to other humans. And that's actually a good thing because that means that we may be able to eradicate it, much like we did smallpox in the late 1970s. In the 1950s, there were an estimated 3 to 4 million cases per year of measles in the United States. Nearly all of those were in children, and it was so common that by the age of 15, basically every child in the U.S. had had measles. This accounted for about 50,000 hospitalizations, and 1,000 children every year were permanently disabled with deafness, seizures, or other neurological problems. And unfortunately, there were about 500 deaths per year. Now, in 1963, a vaccine came out that was very effective against measles, and it caused about a 99% drop in the cases of measles in the United States. What's on your screen right now is a chart of measles cases over time, and you can see the number of cases reported is on the left, and the year is on the bottom there, 1938 up to, it shows 2018. And from 1938 to about 1958, you can see the numbers bouncing around 200,000 up to about 900,000. Now, these are documented cases. These are reported cases. The estimated number is, as I said, in the 3 to 4 million cases per year range. And you can see there's a little arrow that says vaccines licensed in 1963. And immediately there was a huge drop off until you get down to 1968, 1970. And there were these seasonal kind of bounces where you'd have several thousand cases, maybe 70,000 cases, 60,000 cases, something like that. The last big outbreak there was in the late 80s when you had a little bump there. That actually was 55,000 cases, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The inset is really what we're interested in. That little part that says cases from 2000 to 2019, the square on the right. And you can see since 2000, there have been these sporadic outbreaks. Now in 2000, measles was declared no longer endemic in the United States. And what endemic means is that something's coming back in a very regular, predictive, or seasonal pattern. And they said this is no longer endemic. We're not seeing it often enough to say that this is a big problem for the United States at this time. But there are still sporadic outbreaks. The most cases we've had in any one year since the year 2000 was about 1,300 cases in 2019. The vast majority of those cases being in those who are unimmunized. Now this year we've had 3 distinct outbreaks. And as far as the current outbreak, Texas has had the most cases. As of early last week, the number of cases stood at 164, and sadly there was one death of a child who is not immunized for measles. There have been a total of 9 states involved in this current outbreak, and there have been a handful of cases in Georgia. So one thing to take away from that graph is that these kind of outbreaks have happened before. I'm absolutely not downplaying the seriousness of this outbreak. I'm not downplaying the seriousness of the disease either. This is a very dangerous infection. What I am saying is that the numbers are very low and it's unlikely that you're going to be exposed to it. Still, we have to do everything we can to limit exposure and infection. Even in the modern era, this is a very dangerous disease. 1 in 3 children who comes down with measles will go on to develop a complication like ear infection or pneumonia, or croup, which can cause breathing problems, or dehydration. 1 in 4 children will end up in the hospital, and 1 to 2 out of 1,000 children will die from complications of measles, such as pneumonia or encephalitis, which is brain swelling. Now, unfortunately, measles is one of the most contagious diseases there are. In fact, if you're hospitalized with measles, we have to put you in a negative pressure room. And you can see from this picture There's the patient in their negative pressure room. That means that that area of the hospital is under a much lower pressure than outside the room, which would be to the right of where it says passive air. And if you wanted to go see that patient, you would come into the anteroom or antechamber there. And that would be a place where you could look at the patient, and then you would open the next door and you'd hear that whoosh, which would mean that that patient is in a low pressure room and it's continually sucking air into the room that goes out to where it says forced air on the left, and that goes through a filter. And the reason we do that is so that viruses can't float out of that room and affect everyone in the hallway. 9 out of 10 people who are exposed to measles and are susceptible to it, that is, people who don't have immune systems that are functioning well or are not immunized, 9 out of 10 of those people are going to catch it. So this is a big risk if you have no immunity, no matter what your age is. Of course, we do worry about the kids who have the worst outcome, which is going to be less than 5 years of age. Now, you catch measles by inhaling infectious air droplets when someone who's affected coughs, sneezes, or even breathes. And because these particles are so small and light, they can float around for up to 2 hours after the infected person has left the room. So think about this. If you go into a hospital or the ER or a coffee shop even, and someone who's had measles has been there and has been breathing or coughing or sneezing, which they probably will be, you could catch measles. That's why prevention is so important, because it's very hard to stop this from spreading otherwise. Now, when you're exposed to measles, you have about 11 to 12 day incubation period. And what that means is it takes about 11 to 12 days for the symptoms to show up. On this chart, says rubeola, which is what we call measles, symptomology. At the top it says day of illness, and there's 1 through 10. The first sign, under 1 there, you can see that the first sign that shows up is typically a fever. That can get pretty high, up to the 104 to 105 range. The other symptoms that are going to be very early in illness are cough, coryza, and conjunctivitis. You see those down there at the bottom. Conjunctivitis is pink eye. Basically, your red, the white part of the eye will look red and irritated, and they'll probably be watering. And coryza means runny nose, irritated red mucous membranes in the nose, and the nose is really stuffy and runny. Above that, you can see it says Koplicks. Those show up at about day 3. Koplik spots. Those are sores in the mouth, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And those typically look like little white or red and white dots in the mouth. And finally, the last symptom of all these to show up is the rash. So here's a picture of a little girl who has some rash on her face already, but you can see just how red and irritated her eyes are. That's just a picture of the kind of conjunctivitis you're going to see. On this next picture is a very sad looking girl. I feel so terrible for her. Clearly she's going through the fever right now. You can sense that. If you do this job for a while, that kid's going to have a fever. She's got watery red eyes. You can see some irritation around the mouth, and the nose is running and probably pretty stuffy. Fever, cough, runny nose, and watery irritated eyes. What does that sound like? It sounds like just about every cold that you're going to see out there. Now, the next sign to show up, and this is a unique sign for measles, are these things called Koplik spots, and I assume they're named after a Dr. Koplik. And what you can see in this picture is that they are little white dots in the cheek, and sometimes, if you see in the next picture, there you can see some white dots down by the gums there, and on the left you see a red ring with a little white dot in the center. Sometimes they'll be just white dots by themselves. Sometimes they'll be red spots with these white dots in the middle. Now, don't count on seeing these every single time. They can be very subtle, but these spots are what we call pathognomonic for measles. And that's a big word, pathognomonic. It really means that they're a classic sign. You may not always see them with measles, but when you do, that's pretty much going to be measles and measles alone. But like I said, don't count on seeing these every time. Now let's talk about rash. The next couple days after you get the Koplik spots, and this is about 14 days after exposure, a rash is going to show up. And that's what everyone is here for, is to see what the rash looks like. But this takes about 14 days to show up after exposure. And you can see in this photo, here's a child with rash all over the face. Some of these spots are palpable, you can feel them. Some are flat and you can't feel them. That's what we call a maculopapular rash, or a flat and raised rash. Usually this starts around the hairline, behind the ears, and then it spreads down the torso and out to the extremities. The rash lasts about 5 or 6 days, and it's usually not itchy. And you can see in some of these pictures, the kids have some of the stuffiness around the nose and some watery red eyes as well in these photos. Now here's the bad part. The child can spread measles for about 4 days before the rash appears to about 4 days after the rash appears. Now think about that. That means that by the time the rash shows up, the child's been infectious for 4 days. And that's why prevention is the most important thing we can do for measles. So what are we going to do if you think you have measles, or if you think your child has measles? Well, what you need to do is call the doctor's office and say, hey, I suspect measles. We were exposed, we're not immunized, there's some other problem. We think we might have come down with measles. You need to warn your doctor's office. And what you should not do is show up for an appointment and then say, oh, by the way, I might have measles, because everyone in the office is going to be exposed. We do not have negative pressure rooms in our office. I don't know any private doctors who have negative pressure rooms. So when you show up, stay in your car, call the front desk, tell your doctor's staff that there might be measles. They'll come out and see you in the car. If it does look like measles, what's going to happen is you're going to have to contact the health department. You're going to be sent over to the health department where this can be managed, because it is a public health issue. Now at the health department, a special nasal swab would be done to check for measles DNA. There's also a urine test that can be done. And sometimes blood is taken to see if there are antibodies to the measles virus. If everything's looking good, the child will be sent home to be put in isolation until the rash has been present for at least 4 days. Remember, you're infectious 4 days before and 4 days after the rash develops. So we need to stay away from other people during that time. Now, what about treatment? Now, unfortunately, like most viruses, there is no specific treatment for measles. If there are other problems that come up, like bacterial pneumonia develops or encephalitis develops, well, there are treatments for those kind of things. But for measles itself, therapy is what we call supportive therapy. Rest, taking something for fever, making sure that you're drinking plenty of fluids. Vitamin A is recommended as part of the treatment regimen for measles. However, don't go out and buy a bunch of vitamin A and say, I'm going to take vitamin A, there's no way I'll get measles. It doesn't work that way. It's part of a treatment regimen and is not preventive. There's a chemical called ribavirin, which has shown some effect against measles. There are immune globulins, which are antibodies that can be infused. And again, these kind of things, though, are going to be saved for the absolute worst cases. Oxygen, fluids, antibiotics, that's the kind of thing you're going to typically see in the hospital, because people who have measles can have other problems develop. But none of these treatments takes the place of prevention, which is what we're about to talk about. Now, what you can see in this cartoon from the London Mail from 1915, this is during World War I, and it's a little hard to read, and the language is a little bit British and difficult, but well, basically what this lady's saying is, don't worry, the ones on this side, these ones with measles are at the head of the bed, and these ones without measles are at the foot of the bed. So, hey, problem solved. Well, obviously, things don't work that way. As usual, good hand hygiene is very important. Covering your mouth when you cough or sneeze is very important. And that's basically how it is for just about every viral infection. So keep that in mind. For this virus, N95 masks are very effective if they're used consistently and appropriately. But most important is isolating the affected child for 4 days once the rash shows up. Now let's talk about the vaccine for measles. You know me, I'm a very strong proponent of vaccines. We do not dictate what people do in our office. We recommend, and I strongly recommend everyone get the measles vaccine. This is not some experimental rush job. This is not some mRNA vaccine. This is one of the old granddaddy vaccines. It's been around for over 60 years. It is effective and safe. Measles vaccine is usually given as a combination of measles, mumps, and rubella. Typically, we do that at 12 to 15 months and 4 to 6 years, 2 shots are recommended. And that brings up the next chart. Now, I promise that this is going to be the last chart that we see today. But this is a very simple chart. Shows the measles outbreaks in the United States from 1950 to 1955. And again, you have the cases on the left in thousands and the years down along the bottom. And you can see where the vaccine was licensed in 1963 and how the cases dropped off. There were a few big peaks after that, though. 1970 looks like 1977 or so. And there's a peak between 1989 to 1991. At that time, there were 55,000 cases, and unfortunately, there were 120 deaths. I remember this time very well because I was a new college student, and my mother called me and said, "Hey, Chris, you got to come home and get a second shot. They're now recommending 2 shots." And so I went back to the Suwannee County Health Department in Live Oak, Florida, and got my second shot. So that outbreak was considered to be due to waning immunity and non-responders, people who got a first shot but didn't show a good reaction to it. And that's why 2 shots are recommended now. What happens is when you get 2 shots, just about everyone who doesn't respond well to the first will respond to the second and be protected for life. Like I said, in our office, we give the vaccine twice. First is between 12 and 15 months, and again at 4 to 6 years, which is what the CDC recommends. Now, there's one more interesting thing about vaccination, and that's that you can get the vaccine after you're exposed. If you do not have any immunity to measles and someone comes by and coughs on you and they've had measles and you want to do something about it, you can get a vaccine for measles even though you've already been exposed. You have to get it within 72 hours. And the reason it works is because, remember, we said the incubation period takes about 11 to 12 days and you're not infectious during that time. So if you get the measles shot early enough, you can be protected before you get sick, and it's going to keep you from getting sick. It's going to keep you from spreading the disease further. Well, that's about all I can teach you about measles from here. If you liked what you saw, and even if you hated what you saw, then please subscribe and comment to this channel and let us know what you think and what you'd like to see in the future. I think the next thing we're going to talk about, since we started doing these podcasts, a lot of people have said, "Hey, can you just talk about fever and worrying about fever?" And I think that's probably the next thing we're going to do. So please let me know that you're out there so that I'm not just lecturing into the void. But thanks for joining me. And this has been The Buzz, Parenting and Pediatrics with me, Dr. B. We'll see you next time.